The Sony a6400 is truly an amazing camera, and ended up purchasing it at around the same time the Sony a6600 ended up being released, but I don't necessarily feel like I lost too much there, because that camera does cost considerably more than I have now, and I'm perfectly happy with the one I ended up purchasing. The price is definitely considerably better, and it does give me pretty much anything that I could possibly want out of it, for the exception of maybe battery life to an extent. I believe that this camera will still be a great contender for 2020. Even if any new releases might come out, this camera is still going to remain as a fantastic one for a very long time. And I would like to share my experiences with this camera, how great it has been so far, why I will still have it in 2020. Let's dive in. This video is sponsored by Fifine, the makers of some of the best audio gear on a great budget, like the ones from their C1 models featuring a professional grade lavalier mic and the headset mics bundled together. Links to everything below. So this camera has actually been my main one for quite a while, even though I actually purchased it to have as a separate vlogging camera, one that would be easier to vlog with since I already had a main camera, which was my Panasonic Lumix G7. However, this camera is just so many leagues ahead of that camera. Even if the G7 is already a fantastic camera, I even prefer the color signs on that camera versus the Sony's, which is something that it does have over it. This camera is just absolutely amazing. It's reflected in how much more expensive it is. So the exterior design of this camera, it is going to be a fairly small one. This is a mirrorless camera, and it is designed to be very small, similarly to the rest of the Alpha series, at the very least for the 6000 series and the 5000 series that Sony has produced in the past. It's going to be comprised mostly of this soft touch material, and this camera is going to be very hefty. Don't let the size fool you, because this camera does feel very premium and very hefty, as that's exactly what it's supposed to represent. And it's definitely packing a lot more than meets the eye. You're going to find a lot of different buttons and knobs for adjusting things on the fly, and a couple of customizable buttons as well that you can remap to do certain things. I don't necessarily use those buttons all that much, since I actually already have the setting that I use for the most part. I use this camera mostly indoors, so the settings usually just remain the same. Overall though, when I am out vlogging with this camera, it barely takes up any room in my bag. It's a very low profile camera to carry around that is capable of a lot. I very much love it, and I love it specifically for its design as well. You're going to find things like a hot screw mount also, and a microphone port, which wasn't available in a lot of the previous versions. At the very least, you couldn't get the fully flip out screen that you get with this camera, which is now available here. And speaking of the screen, this screen is actually fairly good. It's very good at letting you know if things are in focus, even though another great feature of this camera is that the autofocus is so unbelievably great. It's always doing work behind the scenes to make sure that it's keeping my face in track. Right now, as I'm speaking into the camera, this is the camera I'm shooting with right now, and that I always do for all of my videos, I can see on the screen that it's always trying to track my face, and it's doing an amazing job at just that. However, another thing about it is that it is technically a touchscreen display, even though you hardly get any touch functionality with it. You can touch to focus and things like that, but you can't touch to navigate through the menus or anything of the sort, which is a little bit strange. I don't love that, and I do wish they would implement that. Nonetheless, it is a very good display that Sony implemented here, even if the flip out mechanism is a little bit weird and it makes me a little bit concerned for its durability. It is still a very sturdy hinge that flips out very nicely, but you can tell that the display cable is still being exposed somewhat, so you do have to be careful there. And as for a lot of the Sony cameras of today, this camera is actually going to feature an E-mount instead of your usual Micro Four Thirds mount. So this is going to be a little bit larger than Micro Four Thirds, even though it's not quite full frame, but it's a little bit closer to that. That means that you will have to settle mostly for E-mount lenses. Sony, for the most part, constructs that sort of lenses. So you can definitely depend on getting a lot of great first-party options. Here, I actually stuck for the kit lens that was included with this camera, being the 16 to 50mm lens, which has been amazing for both vlogging and the sort of speaking into the camera style of shots. And I wouldn't look anywhere else necessarily if that's what you're looking to do, as I really do think that it's a fantastic one. Now, I primarily use this camera for videos, as I am just a YouTuber, somebody that has to record a lot of video. And I like to shoot at 4K 24 frames per second, but we're going to talk about both the 4K and the 1080p setting. In 4K, which is the setting that I mostly use to shoot at, you will get amazing footage. Autofocus is still incredibly reliable here. Things just look very sharp. The color signs on Sony's cameras are also very good, even though you do have manual settings so you can adjust on your own. But I very much trust what Sony has done here, because I always get the results that I would want personally. Now, another thing that the Sony a6400 doesn't have is in-body stabilization. That is only available on the 6600 and the 6500 as far as I'm aware. However, you do get stabilization on the lens, so it is not very good, and that is definitely going to be very noticeable with the shots. Sometimes in 4K, you're going to notice quite a bit of warping if you're moving the camera around too much, the footage is going to warp, which could affect you if you're vlogging with it a lot. However, if you're keeping your movements relatively smooth, for the most part, you're not really going to notice it, and it's not even going to be a problem at all. Overall, when it comes to the 4K footage, I am very happy with it. I think it's great. It looks fantastic. Autofocus is always on point, surprisingly even in 4K, which is something that a lot of cameras do struggle with, especially on the budget side. This camera is considered to be somewhat in the mid-range market. It can give you really amazing results, but it's not really all that expensive, which is what makes it so amazing. Now, when it comes to 1080p footage still looks really good, and you do get the ability to record video at 1080p at 60 frames per second. You can still expect really amazing results from it, even though stabilization is still going to be a bit of a problem. Warping is hardly an issue in this mode. From my testing at the very least, you're not going to see a lot of that. Overall, it is still going to be a great experience. Even though at 1080p, I still shoot at 24 frames per second, since that is still my preferred shooting method. But it does do up to 60 frames per second at 1080p. That is something worth noting, and that is something you were looking for. Now, going into the discussions on battery life, it's not amazing, but it's also not really the worst in the market. I would say that it's fairly average, maybe even slightly below average, if anything. So I generally get between an hour and an hour and a half, no more than that, especially if I'm just recording in a row. It can definitely handle quite a bit. This camera does not get very hot, which is something that I very much like as well. If you were wondering, it has never shut down on me for overheating purposes at all. It's never gotten hot to that extent, especially now since we're almost in the middle of the winter here. But overall, battery life is okay, even though I'm not that concerned about it, because I always buy extra batteries for every camera that I purchase, because I always like having those backups, so I'm never that concerned about battery life really. But it was still worth noting. Now, I do have some complaints about this camera, since it's not perfect as much as I love it, and it has been an amazing A-roll camera for the longest time. So let's dive in. For one, I don't like that the screen doesn't support full touch functionality, as in you can't navigate through the menus with it. You can pretty much just touch to focus, which is pretty disappointing considering that it is already a touch display. It would just be best if Sony would make the menus in the interface more touch friendly. That would be nicer. Also, another complaint is going to be that the hot shoe mount, while it is in a good spot, oftentimes if you do have to flip the screen over, for those purposes, the hot shoe mount will get in the way. I ended up purchasing an adapter for it so that I would be able to have the hot shoe pointing in a different direction so that it wouldn't block up the screen as I do right now. So it's not really that big of a deal, but it is still worth noting. And another problem is going to be that warping that I just spoke of. On this camera in particular, the warping seems to be pretty bad in 4K. Now, unless you're really moving the camera extremely fast, it might not be that noticeable. You might still see it, but it might not be that much of a bother. But if you are moving around with it very quickly, you're gonna see that it is pretty intense. And I do hope that that is something that is corrected in the future. Also, another thing is just going to be the battery life. It's not really amazing. Their newest model, the A6400, actually does a lot better when it comes to battery life. People say that it is almost double of what it is here, which is incredibly amazing. So that is something worth noting. And if you were expecting a headphone jack for this one, it has a microphone port, but not a headphone jack. If you're expecting headphone jack for this camera, then you won't get it. You should look at the later model instead. I did praise this camera to high heaven throughout this review, and it's because it really is an amazing camera. And I believe that for 2020 and moving forward, since this camera was also released so recently, it's still going to last you quite a while. I've been able to get amazing footage from it, and this camera isn't even all that expensive for what it offers. If your budget was around $1,000 and the kit lens is good enough for you, as it is good enough for me, by all means, I would consider this camera over the rest of the competition, because there just isn't really that much of it right now. Sony does dominate the market, I would say, when it comes to very light and portable 4K cameras that just deliver so much power and so much efficiency versus the rest of the market. So I strongly recommend the Sony a6400, even moving into 2020 if this is your budget. If you do have the extra budget for the newest model, get that one. But if you would rather save yourself some money, then you cannot go wrong with the 6400. Highly recommended. So now, if you're looking to purchase this camera, I will be making sure to leave affiliate links to Amazon in the description. If you do use our links to make a purchase, and we do get a small commission that helps us run things a little bit more smoothly around here, so we would very much appreciate it. This has been Francisco from Tech Summit. Thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you all later. Enjoy.